Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person and online for the second day of the final conference of the EU IDEA project. My name is Emily Fitzpatrick. I'm an analyst at the European Policy Centre, and I'll be moderating this morning's session, which has the lengthy title, the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, Implications for Internal and External EU Differentiation. For those of us that are joining us for the first time today, I'll just briefly reintroduce the EU IDEA project before moving on to the topic at hand. The project has the full name, EU Integration and Differentiation for Effectiveness and Accountability. It is funded by Horizon 2020 and is a consortium of 15 EU and non-EU organizations looking at how much and what form of differentiation is conducive to a more effective, cohesive, and democratic EU. And one work stream within this project was the Observatory on Brexit, the aim of which was to monitor the Brexit process and outputs from a variety of angles to assess the challenges and opportunities that the process posed for differentiated integration and cooperation. So as mentioned, for today's topic, we are looking at the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA for short, and we're asking, what does this mean for EU differentiation? So I'm hoping that we can begin by touching on the current state of EU-UK relations as governed by the TCA, which has been enforced for over a year now. It came into force provisionally from the 1st of January 2020. But also that we can take a longer term perspective on what this new relationship means for further integration internally within the Union. We can touch on specific policy areas, but also the institutional dynamics of the EU, as well as looking externally at what this new relationship means for how the EU relates to other non-member states in its neighbourhood and further abroad. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers for today. We have Mr. Stefan Führing from the European Commission, Head of Unit on the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. On my right, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre. Brigid Laffan, who is the former Director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. And joining us online, but he hasn't popped up yet, is Ian Bond, the Director of Foreign Policy at the Centre for European Reform in London. Just also to note briefly, within the context of the Observatory on Brexit, there were two deliverables, two papers published by our speakers today. The first on Brexit and external differentiation in foreign security and defence policy by Ian Bond, and the second on the EU-UK partnership, implications for differentiation within the EU and between the EU and third countries by Fabian and on my predecessor, Janika Vasilak. And I hope our speakers can bring some of their conclusions into our discussion today. So I have an initial question to open the discussion for each of our speakers, but then we'll open the floor. And for those of you following online, you can put your question into the Q&A box, and I will try to come to as many as possible. So without further ado, we can begin the discussion. And my first question will come to you, Stefan. In the initial weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was talk of a potential rapprochement between the EU and the UK, based on kind of a realization that there are some fundamental values that we do share and on the basis of which we should cooperate. So I was hoping you could give us your institutional perspective on where we stand at the current moment, and to what extent, if any, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has provided a basis for coordinating EU and UK responses to the challenges posed by the war. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and good morning. So 2 questions Indeed, the institutional relations between the UK and the EU are now governed by basically two agreements, the withdrawal agreement and the TCA. Let's leave the withdrawal agreement aside for a moment, but I'm sure we come to it. When it comes to the TCA, and picking up on your question, I think one can look at the Ukraine war from the EU perspective from four perspectives. It's CFSP, CSDP, sanctions, which is a subset, but since it's hard law, as it were, I want to mention it separately, migration and refugees, and fourthly, energy. And if I now, if you like, deconstruct the challenge like this, and I look at the TCA, I can conclude the following. On CSFP, CSDP, there's virtually nothing in the TCA. On sanctions, there's literally nothing in the TCA. On migration, refugees, there's zero in the TCA. Actually, on mobility itself, there's practically nothing except for some very ancillary provisions on short-term visa and on mobility of researchers. So again, there's nothing in the TCA. And on energy, there is a framework of cooperation in the TCA, also on security of supply. So there is informal talks happening between the EU and the relevant experts in the EU and the UK when it comes to security of supply. But I want to make the point that this is light years away from what happens at the moment amongst member states. I was told the relevant expert groups meet almost daily at the moment. The energy of supply, so both gas and electricity and oil and petrol, meet almost daily, and this is of course a totally different landscape than what happens with the UK. So in short, my answer would be the relevance of the TCA in the current conflict and how EU and UK work together in responding to it are close to zero.
Thank you very much. Okay. Fabian, I'll come to you next for your assessment of where we stand between the EU and the UK. And as mentioned, you wrote a paper that's very relevant to today's discussion. So maybe you could bring in some of your conclusions and whether recent events have impacted your findings at all.
Sure. Thanks very much. I fully agree with what has just been said. I think in a very narrow way, we can say the TCA is working. It's working in terms of regulating the trade relationship with the UK. But even within that narrow sense, it has to be said that there are enormous costs which are being imposed by having the TCA. It's certainly, when we come to the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, we still have many unanswered questions, and Brigid, I'm sure, will go into that. And when it comes, and I think this is the third element I would highlight, when it comes to the political declaration, those ambitions which we had put in the political declaration simply haven't been fulfilled at all. So not because the EU didn't try, but because there was no wish from the current UK government to have this kind of cooperation. So when it comes to the current crisis, yes, there is talk, there is a level of coordination, but in my view, it falls way short of what should be happening at this stage, given that European security is a shared interest and should be approached differently. But I think this is the context in which we have to see the EU-UK relationship now. It is not a good relationship. It is struggling to overcome some of the difficulties which were there in the negotiations. But I think the fundamental problem remains that for this UK government, it is still about domestic politics. It is still about trying to gain political points in the domestic context, and very little consideration is actually given to the wider implications of that. I think what all that highlights, and that's also what we covered in the paper, is that this form of differentiated integration is very different from the other forms of cooperation we have with different countries in Europe. In my view, it will remain very different. It is not a settled relationship. It is something which will continue to be conflictual and difficult. It has also changed the European Union on the inside, both in terms of how particular policy issues are being approached and in the kind of decisions which can be taken. And I think this is an important moment to also recall that some of the things which have happened since the UK left probably wouldn't have been possible with the UK as a member state. Particularly thinking here about the recovery and resilience funds, borrowing at the EU level. I do not see that a British government could have ever agreed to that. So it has already changed. But I think the big question for the future is going to be, when it comes to the relationship with the UK, is how do we manage divergence, which is going to come in a much greater way. And I would say that with the current crisis, even more so from the EU side, because things will change within the EU. We were already mentioning energy as one of the areas where we will see big changes. So how do we manage then divergence? But the other question for me is there also something we should learn, we should apply from the Brexit process to the current challenges we have? Is there a Brexit method which can actually help us to come to decisions quicker, more effectively, in more unity when it also comes to questions like Ukraine? So these are open questions at the moment, but when it comes to the EU-UK relationship, unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic because I think, at least with this current government, I don't see much scope for a more constructive relationship.
Thanks very much. Definitely, I think in the short term, it's quite a pessimistic outlook, but maybe some lessons we can take going forward. Brigid, I might come to you next. Yes, for your assessment of the state of play.
Okay, can I begin with, because the focus of our discussion this morning is on internal and external differentiation. And what Brexit did in the first instance was it revealed in the starkest possible way the difference between being a member state and being differentiated within the union and leaving the union. The power balances are simply very different. If you're a member state, you have power within the system because you can prevent the member states doing stuff. So you have a bargaining position. So what it reveals, number one, is that external differentiation is a very different form of differentiation, and particularly in terms of the power balances. Secondly, the UK exit from the EU removed the champion, a large state champion of internal differentiation. And as Fabian said, that has consequences. And I fully agree. I see no circumstances in which the RRF would have been agreed as part of the EU budget. All we have to do is think back to the European Council 2011 on the fiscal treaty. So it has generated a capacity within the union for more cohesion on some issues. Then moving to external differentiation. If we remember the Barnier-Scalier, that was a very ordered, structured set of steps, but the world is much messier than the escalier à la Barnier, because the EU has very different arrangements and agreements with its neighbours, and those depend on preferences, on what the EU is willing to offer, the institutional arrangements, and also, of course, the power balances. And the EU's relations with its neighbours are constantly evolving. They're not settled. They're constantly, and they're very different frameworks. But saying all of that, the weakest one by far is the TCA. It is really the thinnest possible set of arrangements, and it comes about because, in a way, it was the clash of red lines. that if you wanted a sovereignty first Brexit, then that excluded so much of what the UK and the EU could do together. It was minimalist. But even then, within the EU-UK relationship, there is internal differentiation in the UK itself, and that's the Northern Ireland Protocol, because the sovereignty first Brexit was only for GB. It wasn't for the UK. That London decided that in the interest of a sovereignty first Brexit for GB, it was willing to have very different conditions for part of its own country. And that has dramatically altered the dynamics of the island of Ireland. And we will see this being played out over the next 20, 30 years. Brexit, there was no good Brexit for the island of Ireland in terms of stability. There was no good Brexit for Northern Ireland in terms of intercommunal relations. They have now become extremely politicized. And the cleavage between unionism and nationalism is much more acute than it has been for a very long time. And we're left with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I have no doubt that there is a viable set of arrangements between the London and Brussels on the protocol, that an awful lot can be done, could be done to smooth out the differentiation within the UK. And there is an enormous willingness on the part of the EU to do so. But it's become politicized within Northern Ireland. We have Northern Ireland elections on the 5th of May. It looks as if for the first time since the foundation of Northern Ireland, nationalists will have more seats than unionists in the potentially in the next arrangement. And that's a historic first, which again raises questions about the longer term sustainability of Northern Ireland as a part of the UK. And unionism itself is now very anti the protocol. And that is, in my view, a historic mistake, because there is no way that you can reintroduce a border on the island of Ireland. And so the question is there an accommodation that will work? I think there's a technical accommodation available, but whether or not there's a political accommodation available will, for example, at some stage, this Conservative government trigger Article 16, etc., etc. So a lot of instability. And the fact that the NIP has not been settled, in my view, leaks back into the TCA. It's sort of, you have the TCA and the withdrawal agreement, and they're the two pillars, and one pillar is very shaky, and so it makes the other pillar weaker. And so I would conclude by saying our relations between the UK and the EU in any way commensurate with the kind of relationship you should have with a near neighbour, and the answer is absolutely not. Can be built on, but in my view will never be built on under a Johnson government. The one good thing that has happened is that Lord Frost has departed, because he's a complete ideologue. He's obsessed with a form of sovereignty that's never existed in practice. And so I think his departure at least is helpful. But I listened to Rhys Mogg yesterday when he said that the NIP has to be renegotiated and reformed. So there's a lot of ideologues left, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much, Brigid. Some really interesting points there that we can pick up on later. And indeed, the point on the protocol is very relevant, seeing as we have the elections in Northern Ireland coming in May. Finally, Ian, I'll turn to you on the screen now. If you wanted to say a few words on the state of play, but also your paper was on external differentiation in foreign security and defense policies. So could you maybe elaborate on whether this current war in Ukraine has caused the parties to rethink the relationship or lack of on this field? And are there any possible arrangements outside the scope of the TCA that the EU and the UK could come to cooperate? Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed. And let me say to start with that I'm really sorry that having caught COVID, I can't actually be with you in person. I was looking forward to being in Brussels for the first time since early 2020, but there we are. It'll have to wait another month or two. I mean, I found myself agreeing with almost everything that has been said so far. the TCA is a very weak reed, and that is by design of the British government. And I agree that we still have a government which has too many ideologues and not enough pragmatists in it. What I wanted to do was to focus on the area that was left out of the TCA completely, and that's foreign security and defense cooperation, because that has become particularly salient in the light of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and I think that is having an impact on the way that at least some parts of the British government are approaching the EU. But perhaps just before I do that, I did want to pick up on one point about differentiation itself, which sort of kept coming up yesterday as well. And that's the question of whether differentiation is in fact a good thing in itself. And I think in a sense, the experience of Brexit shows that it has its dangers. I mean, it's a good thing if it allows some countries to rush ahead in areas that others are not yet ready to proceed in. And the early days of the Schengen area would be one example of that. But I thought that the former Danish Perm Rep Paul Christoffersen made an interesting point yesterday when he sort of was talking about the Danish opt-outs and the way that they were a reluctant response from the Danish government to losing a referendum. And I thought there was a big contrast there from the UK position, where successive British governments, especially conservative ones, but not exclusively, aggressively pursued opt-outs in order to show that they weren't being seduced by the attractions of European integration. And that created a kind of permanent negative narrative about the EU that eventually led to Brexit. And I think for the remaining member states, that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about how to proceed in some areas where there isn't full consensus. Now, turning back to the TCA and foreign policy, I mean, one thing that's really striking is that in the early stages of the negotiations, when Theresa May was still Prime Minister, I think it was taken for granted that arrangements for foreign policy cooperation would be easy to agree because they were so evidently in the interests of both sides. And I was involved in a project working on what those arrangements might look like. Which turned out to be completely useless because as soon as Boris Johnson and David Frost got their hands on the steering wheel, they decided that this was not a direction that they wanted to go in. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was tactical, the belief that adding foreign policy to the negotiating mix would complicate things and put the UK in the position of a demandeur for that, which would give the EU leverage in other areas. But the second one, and this coincides very much with what Brigid said about David Frost, was ideological. I mean, David Frost, and also when he was Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, believed that states could be foreign policy actors, but a supranational institution like the EU couldn't. And therefore, their focus was entirely on bilateral relationships and steering clear of too much institutional contact with the EU. Now, I mean, that put the UK at the extreme outer edge of external differentiation in foreign and security policy. The EU has a wide variety of contractual relationships with countries ranging from the United States and Japan to the countries of the Western Balkans and with their association agreements and so on. But one of the lessons that I think I'd already drawn, but which has been underlined even more firmly from the war in Ukraine, is that actually the EU's foreign policy external differentiation is a mess. I mean, there are some lessons that the UK is probably drawing from the current situation. One is that actually the EU institutions are important actors in some aspects of foreign policy, and particularly when it comes to sanctions. I mean, it's also underlined that actually there is a value in having relations with individual member states because they don't agree on all aspects of this crisis. And, we have a much closer relationship with, say, the Nordic Baltic group, perhaps also with Poland, where there's a shared view of the Russian threat, and a more distant relationship with some of the countries which don't share that perception of the Russian threat. But I do think that the most important lesson that the UK will take away from this is that actually the contractual relationships that the EU has with third countries in the foreign and security policy area will not really tell you very much about how close they'll be in a crisis. And I think this is a point that Juha Jokela underlined yesterday in the second session, that political alignment has mattered more than institutional arrangements. Some of the countries in the Western Balkans that on paper should be cleaving to the EU's foreign policy positions 100%, are in fact closer in some respects to Russia than they are to the EU, whereas there are other countries with much weaker institutional relationships, which nonetheless have been following the EU's line pretty closely. So, I mean, what that argues for is, I think, a more pragmatic approach on the UK side to cooperation in foreign policy with the EU. And I think while Brigid is right to say there is still plenty of ideologues in the British government, the fact that at least Liz Truss turned up to a Foreign Affairs Council, the first British Foreign Secretary to do so since Brexit, is at least one positive sign. We still do need to get over the ideological nonsense. But at the same time, I think the EU also needs to look again at the contractual relationships that it has for foreign policy cooperation and ask itself why they're not working terribly well, and why having a close contractual relationship with the EU is no guarantee that the EU can in fact keep you on side doing the things that the EU would like to do in the midst of the most serious security crisis that we've seen in Europe, certainly since the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, and perhaps even as far back as the end of the Second World War.
Thanks very much. And indeed, that's quite an interesting question about the UK pursuing bilateral or group arrangements with certain EU member states and what that might mean for the EU's foreign and security competence overall. Fabian, I know you wanted to come in to respond to some of these statements, but I just wanted to remind participants that you can send your questions into the Q&A box online or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question in the room. Thanks.
Thanks, yeah. I wanted to pick up something Ian said, because I think it's important to recognize that we are no longer in the field of foreign policy in a limited way. If we're talking about Ukraine crisis, we have to talk about everything. We have to talk about energy. We have to talk about migration. We have to talk about industrial policy. We have to talk about trade. We have to talk about solidarity mechanism. So even if there is some limited cooperation on foreign policy proper, if you like, that doesn't answer the question of how do we coordinate across all of these different policy areas where we have a huge challenge within the European Union, let alone with a third country. And we can see on the example of migration that there is no way we could have implemented what we have now with the UK still as a member state. It's very clear that the UK is not willing to take Ukrainians in the way other countries in the EU have done. So I think there is a big challenge in that form of cooperation, even if there was a more constructive player in London. But I think the other point, which I think is absolutely right, is that also from an EU perspective, we have to look at all of our policies and see what this crisis actually means in terms of the capacity to act, in terms of the executive powers we have at the European level. And that's what I was also referring to in terms of divergence. We are going to have to make many changes across different policy areas. And that can also be challenging. What if, for example, we change our climate commitments in the short term? How does that then tally with the commitments we have made under the TCA for non-regression? So there are big challenges to come, and behind all of that is still the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is not resolved. So if we take all of that together, unfortunately, the conclusion I come to is that things will get more difficult rather than better.
Yes, and indeed that question of divergence is very interesting, and the TCA sets up a very detailed governance structure to manage that, which might be interesting to hear how that is operating. But Brigid, you wanted to come in?
So just to add to Fabian's long list of things that are now on the table, we have to also put enlargement and enlargement processes and how the EU views this back on the table, because it is historically the EU's strongest foreign policy card. But of course, it's not foreign policy. It's also internalizing a third country in the EU itself. And I think all of that is on the table now. So we're at one of these pivotal transformative moments in the history of the continent, in European history. And everything, in my view, is up for grabs. That the whole order that was post-Cold War order and settlement was simply overtaken by the war, and none of this is easy. But I think one has to think about how can the EU manage right across the range. In other words, where is its strategic capacity and where can it garner that? And that's not state capacity in the classical sense, but it's collective capacity, the whole and the parts.
Yeah, and the question of enlargement, I guess, when we're looking at the UK and Brexit, it's actually a state that doesn't want to be a member anymore. And what can we learn about a neighbour that isn't interested in EU membership? Stefan, I might come to you next on that question of the governance structure of the TCA. How has the first round of the partnership councils and the specialized committees that the TCA set up fared? And is this a model that will be replicated in other agreements the EU has with third countries?
Governance of the TCA, it's really bread and butter. Huh? What's the starting point of the TCA? The TCA is basically a compilation of a free trade agreement, a standard free trade agreement, with a standard air transport agreement, with a standard aviation safety agreement, with a standard passenger name records agreement, with a standard security of information agreement, with a standard agreement of cooperation with Europol and Eurojust and so on. It's really just that. And I think it has been said before, it's the thinnest possible arrangement. And I think there was a very good observer, I don't know who it was, in January 2021, who said, it was someone from UK industry who said, well, you are now all clapping yourself on the shoulder for the agreement, but what you have agreed here, we would have called it in 2016 a no deal. Because the expectations, if you compare with what industry had called for back in 2016-17, it was like involvement in agencies, even parts being included in parts of the internal market and so on. I mean, the TCA is light years away from this. What does it mean for governance, to come to your question, sorry. So we have a very standard governance of this agreement where you have a specialized committee. All of them have met once last year, except for the one on fisheries, tellingly that has met twice. These meetings last an hour and a half. And then we spent about 3 weeks agreeing on the minutes for it, because it's published. And that's it. And this year we're going to have again a meeting of whatever, an hour and a half. Almost all of them will take place after summer, except for fisheries, where we have one actually next week, and aviation safety in June. Anyway, my point is, this is light years away from what the UK was used to when they were members. I mean, it's just qualitatively, it's not, it's really qualitatively something totally different. And indeed, as has been said, there was a big shift in the whole negotiations. When we were negotiating back in 2017, we said to the May government, look, this is binary. It's digital, 0-1, either you're a member state or not. And the UK side said, I mean, I was there, they said, oh, yeah, you with your binary crap and you with your digital 0-1. Come on, let's find ways here to take part in. I mean, the Chequers proposal of summer 2018 was exactly this. It was breaking through the binary logic by picking one part, only one of the 4 fundamental freedoms, to move forward there and to remain integrated. Then came the next government in December 2020 and 2019, and overnight everything changed. And they told us, look, we are perfectly fine with 0 in your digital logic. And then, I mean, then we moved on. So much about, and finally, a thought I can't help back on the internal differentiation. It's very interesting because I've never looked at it like this, but if you talk to the old guard, so to say, in Brussels, who have followed the negotiations of the treaty reforms, even back to Maastricht and then Amsterdam and so on, they all roll eyeballs when they think of the UK, because most of the time was spent on opt-outs and opt-ins and re-opt-ins and block opt-ins. Back then, you remember when then the ECJ became competent for Justice Home Affairs, and all this. And if you look at it with hindsight, was a bit of a waste of time, huh? Because at the end they left anyhow.
Thanks very much. I'll open the floor if there's anyone who would like to ask any questions. Do we have any here?
I think it's important to say that firstly, the TCA is not only thin, it's also precarious. If we actually look at the number of possible breakpoints which are going to come, I think that's an issue which we will have to address. And that's linked also to the Northern Ireland Protocol and what might happen there, where we are now in a situation where certainly the unionist side, or at least the political unionist side, because there is also differentiation there, is opposed to any implementation of the protocol. So how that is going to work, I think is anyone's guess. But what we've also seen is that the UK is not willing to implement certain things, both in Northern Ireland, but also with regard to the rest of the agreement. And that's, I think, we've had a number of postponements of particular points. How long is that feasible? How long can we continue to just simply have a patchy implementation because it is not convenient for the UK? So what that leads me to conclude is that, unfortunately, despite the importance of the challenge we have at the moment, the difficulties we have at the moment, we cannot disregard the possibility that things will get much worse in the relationship, that we will have to deal with a real challenge to EU-UK relations, which is exactly the opposite of where we should be, given the crisis we're facing in common. But I think, unfortunately, I don't see that with the current government that is going to change. I think what we have seen, and yes, Lord Frost has been one of the most vocal proponents of that, but what we have seen is that whenever there are domestic political difficulties, Brexit is what is chosen to try to get the government out of that hole. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see in the next few months and years, as long as the Johnson government is there.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on the point on opt-outs that was raised by Stefan and Brigid, and maybe come to you, Ian, in case you wanted to respond to any of the points, but also to ask, Brigid mentioned the difference between differentiation within the union, having an opt-out, and being outside the club. And the UK was indeed availing of multiple opt-outs while it was a member. But we have the potential election of Marine Le Pen as President of France as of next weekend. We'll see how it goes. But her manifesto from Europe has been described as Frexit in all but name. So I'm wondering what lessons could we take from the process of having the UK as an uncomfortable member within the club? Do opt-outs work, or should we take UK exit as an opportunity to reduce internal differentiation? And I'll come back to you, Brigid, after. Thanks.
Well, my my answer to that would be yes, you should, for the reasons that I sketched out. I mean, I'm hoping that the French opinion polls are right, and that Marine Le Pen is not going to win. But if she does, the kinds of well, I mean, you know, she's not really asking for opt-outs. She's asking for France not to be bound by large areas of EU law, and to do that, you know, unilaterally by calling referendums in France. I think that's completely incompatible with the effective working of the union. So yeah, I mean, it seems to me that although there is a natural inclination to try and accommodate a big member state with specific problems, it would be an incredibly dangerous road to go down. And Brexit does indeed give a sort of cautionary example that once you start down this road, it's really quite difficult to stop, short of leaving the union.
Thank you, Brigid.
So I think that the assumption that Brexit means internal differentiation cannot and does not work, I'm not so sure it's proven by the evidence. Yes, the UK ultimately left, but it left, in my view, because domestic political dynamics were such that the people were offered a choice. Whereas I think with internal differentiation, it has allowed for it has allowed the EU to deal with expanding heterogeneity. It's now a very large union, and I think the EU will always have elements of differentiation because of the nature of the beast and because of the level of heterogeneity in Europe. Of course, it is desirable that there are limits to that, and that there are certain areas, for example, values or internal market, where it simply can't and doesn't apply. But I would draw no comparison between a Le Pen presidency in Paris and London, because what Brexit has also taught us is that the UK was not an indispensable EU member state, whereas in my view, France is. And I don't think the EU can survive a Le Pen presidency. I think it is of that order, because it would be a large pays fondateur basically opting out of the legal system. And I don't think the EU is struggling already with our friends with Orban and Warsaw. And so I think Le Pen in order of magnitude in terms of danger, systemic danger to the EU, is just of a different order. And the second thing I would say is that it also matters if you're euro, non-euro, because the euro becomes fragile if you have a large member state governed by someone like Le Pen. So I think they're just, and there's one other thing I should say about differentiation in the EU, and that is that most differentiations are time-bound and they run out. The areas that are less time-bound tend to be core state powers. But what we also see, and this emerged very strongly from the empirics of our project on differentiation, and that is that there is selective buy-in. In other words, countries opt out and opt back in. And I think it was, the statistic was very high. On about 54% of opportunities to opt back in, they're taken. So there's a lot of disguised there's a lot of differentiation on the surface.
Thanks very much, Brigid. We have one question from the floor. two, we'll come to you after. We'll take a few and then go back to our speakers.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Henrik Leitenberger. I'm a consultant in EU Public Affairs at Milton Europe. I had one question with you to the question of internal differentiation that we just talked about. I was going to originally ask about the question about whether Le Pen could be seen to at least rhetorically pursue a policy of differentiation, but that's already been dealt with. But perhaps to ask more generally then in this context, given that kind of the renegotiation of David Cameron in 2015, 2016 showed kind of where the limits of legal differentiation within the EU lay, that we are now dealing with the question of how do we counter the rhetoric of internal differentiation used by populists, now that we kind of know, at least in practice, where the limits of internal differentiation are. But we now have a challenge of communicating this to the wider public, of what is being sold as a different style of membership is actually essentially exit by stealth. And the other question I wanted to ask, which is a bit, goes back to the original conversation around the UK government and its treatment of it. We've talked a lot about ideology, but should we also talk a bit more about incompetence in this context, given that there is, if you look at the domestic situation in the UK government has consistently struggled to implement its own domestic priorities and has not managed to bring a lot of its own legislative priorities forward because, to put it very bluntly, it doesn't do detail. I mean, we're thinking here, for instance, of the levelling up agenda, energy strategy and the like, where there's a lot of rhetoric but very little action. And maybe this is another, basically, is this another thing that we need to consider, that even if there was a will, there is not really the skill, essentially, to bring certain action forward.
Thanks very much. We'll take another question from the floor.
Just a quick question again on the reaction to the war in Ukraine, because I think, in the reaction of the UK and the EU, we have seen a dynamic of alignment, basically, on all major policies. But on the other side, we also witness a dynamic of competition, I would say, between London and Brussels, when we look, for example, at the relationship with the US, or also the relationship with Kiev itself, so with the eastern neighborhood of the European Union. For example, the visit that Boris Johnson paid to Zelensky just after the visit by von der Leyen, the main EU institutions. So what does this say, in your view, about the future of the relationship between EU and UK? Thanks.
Thanks very much. We'll take one more question and then we'll go back to our speakers.
Yes, hello, thank you. I'm Juha Jokela from Helsinki. Fia, and just to follow up what Nicoletta raised also, because I was listening to you and I was thinking UK as one of these strategic competitors of EU, and especially now with the war in Ukraine as well. And I was wondering how prepared EU is to face that competition on these different fields of the relationship. We all know that the EU was very united with regard to the withdrawal agreement and the TCA negotiations. There was also this worry, I think, at the beginning of the Brexit process that the UK might use the security card in the negotiations and try to bargain. It didn't do that. Now the situation might have a little bit changed, as Ian pointed out, that the UK don't have to use that card, or it's kind of, there is a different situation where the UK is providing the security. And this could, of course, play into the EU dynamics as well and the member states' views. So I was just thinking if you have any views on how this internal cohesion and unity with regard to UK might develop in the future in this context of war in Europe.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So we have questions on the communication on internal differentiation, UK ideology or incompetence, alignment or competition between the EU and the UK, and member states' coherence. I might come to you first, Stefan, if you want to answer any or all of these interesting questions.
I have some thoughts on two, the last one and the one on what happened in February 2016, the new settlement that Cameron negotiated. Dynamic of competition. I cannot talk so much about the CSFP, CSDP in terms of economics. Actually, you're totally right. And I keep saying, even within our system, at every occasion, that we will be competing on three fronts. We will be competing in regulatory terms, we will be competing in access to world markets, And then, of course, there's the general competition of economic actors, players. And it's true that I'm not sure that everyone has always understood this. So the TCA does not remove any of this competition. I mean, of course, there's level playing field, non-regression, there's quite detailed rules on subsidies, but beyond this, we are being competitors in these areas. And sometimes I wonder if everyone has understood this. On the comparison, what happened in the run-up to the famous European Council, I think it was in February 2016, with Cameron's new settlement. I mean, there was one fundamental difference to today, that is, member states were hesitant, but they were willing to enter this exercise, which was a bit mad anyhow, to commit to a treaty change if the treaty is changed, to do these changes, for example, the famous opt-out from the sentence from the preamble and so on, ever closer union. I wonder if there would be such a willingness nowadays to enter this exercise, if now, because Cameron, he was basically visiting 3 heads of states per day to convince them to enter this exercise where there was not much to gain really for the EU. I wonder if Ms. Le Pen tried to do this, what the response would be.
Thanks very much. Perhaps that's an example of a lesson learned from the Brexit process. We'll give each of the speakers a chance to respond. So Fabian, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the points, just to pick up on David Cameron's renegotiation, if you can call it that, what he was saying when he was going around seeing all these heads of state and government was, unless you give us this, we're going to leave. Now, we now know that they left anyway. So it made very little difference. And in part, it made very little difference because even internally, they couldn't really find the areas where they wanted to have a significant change. I think it's important to look back at the balance of competences review, where they actually struggled to find anything which they wanted to renegotiate. So it ended up with some symbolism, with some areas where they could have done a lot anyway, which had nothing to do with the treaty. So I think this was also highlighting that at that point, the UK already had a number of areas of opt-out, a number of areas where it didn't have to take part. So the amount of renegotiation which was possible was very limited, because as a member state, the UK already had a very, from their perspective, a very preferential deal. They could choose to take part or not in a number of different areas. I think in terms, but what it also highlighted, and that's coming back to the point I made before, the difference between opting out of policies or not taking part in policies and opting out of the basic legal framework. And that's, I think, the difficulty was that the expectation which was created in the UK was that this was a way of controlling migration. And that's when it came into the free movement areas where it wasn't possible to create a treaty opt-out for a member state. It wouldn't be desirable, even if it was legally possible. On the war in Ukraine and alignment, I would call it accidental alignment. I don't think it was a deliberate choice by the UK government to align with the European Union. It just happened to be that, firstly, a lot was driven also by the US. So we had the same partner and we're aligning because of that. But also because, broadly speaking, in many areas, there was the same approach. But in other areas, there wasn't. And in those areas where there was a different approach, there was no alignment at all. When it comes to migration, for example, when it came to how you deal with the oligarchs, there wasn't any alignment. So I think there was a level of accidental alignment, but it was nothing like a strategic process where we would have had a high-level discussion on how do we coordinate. And this is in line with, unfortunately, and that's going back to the political declaration where we said we would cooperate on these kind of issues. but it's not happening. And we already saw that, unfortunately, with COP in Glasgow, that there is not that strategic level discussion of how do we achieve our common objectives jointly at the international sphere. And yes, there is some blame can be put on the European Union in that. I think not in a deliberate way. I think my main comment on that would be at the moment that the EU is neglecting the EU-UK relationship. We're just ignoring the UK. But I think the main reason why this is not happening is because the UK government has no willingness whatsoever to do it. And that is driven by the ideology which is behind that. It is also driven by incompetence. It is a very incompetent government. But even if it was a competent government, it wouldn't change this ideological stance. And maybe in some ways it would be more frightening to have a competent Eurosceptic government which was trying to sabotage things effectively. So I think what we are ultimately in is a period where this is going to get worse. And the rhetoric, and I think it was interesting to see over the last few weeks how the rhetoric also changed in the British media. Because what you're reading now is that the EU is failing and that the only country which is doing the right thing in Europe is the UK, and that it has been doing the right thing from the beginning. And all of that proves that Brexit was exactly the right choice because you couldn't do it if you were still in the European Union. I'm not saying I believe that rhetoric, but that's what you're reading now. And that's also going to be what many people in the UK believe. And just to add the little anecdote, there was an opinion poll just now which was asking people in the UK who they wanted to win in France, whether Macron or Le Pen. And among conservatives, there was a significant majority which wanted Le Pen to win. This is an ideological battle. In the end, it's not that different from Trump. It's about a wish that the EU doesn't exist.
Thanks very much. Brigid, if you'd like to come in.
So firstly, on the Cameron settlement, I think that was a one-off, last-ditch effort to keep the UK in the EU. Will not be repeated again. And there was a lot of relief once the referendum was over that in fact the EU did not have to sign up to that, because I certainly picked up a lot of sentiment about the EU had gone too far in trying to accommodate Cameron. In terms of the narrative, and of course, the process of Brexit was bad for populists because it was a living experiment and demonstration in how hard it is to disentangle oneself in an era of complex interdependence. So what we now see from populists is no longer Frexit or Polexit or whatever. What we see is a more a la carte, that we want this kind of EU and this bit of the EU, but not the whole package. On incompetence, I think that there's, interestingly, I would say it really is a poor cabinet by the standards of cabinet government in the United Kingdom. And partly because the Conservative Party has really lost a lot through Brexit. It's lost a lot of very good people because they couldn't, in the end, they either couldn't live with Johnson or the ERG couldn't live with them. But if you look at the last election, a lot of serious Conservatives lost their seats. Interestingly, the one minister whom I think is doing very well in this government is Ben Wallace in defence. I think he has shown himself to be extremely competent and, interestingly, is very pragmatic, not ideological, and working very hard in terms of Ukraine to supply hardware. On the whole area of cooperation competition, of course, relations with the UK, because it is a large country, we're always going to be an admixture of competition and cooperation. Small states know they're small. They know that they have limited capacity to go it alone, whereas the UK is firstly ideologically committed to divergence, in search of divergence, but also wants to prove that Brexit has benefits and bonuses, and therefore will go out of its way. I think, so on the one hand, should the EU be fearful? One country is more nimble than a system of 27, but on the other hand, I wouldn't underestimate the sheer pulling power of the single market. I think that's major structural power that the EU has, and there's nothing the UK can do about it. And we know from the experience of Brexit that it has had a direct impact on UK trade and on economic exchange, and not in the interests of the UK. So I think the system needs to be very attentive to divergence and competition and watch very carefully. But the EU should also be confident in its capacity to deal with to deal with this in terms of world markets and as an economic player. But of course, it is not desirable that the EU-UK relationship is as thin as it is as politicized as it is, and is as ideological as it is, because ideally one would want stable, good neighborly relations. And what often strikes me in the discourse in the UK is that somehow or other the discourse is around something abstract called the EU, but actually it's about the neighbors. It's about the UK's neighbors. It's about where it is in the world. And it hasn't managed to drift north or drift west, where it has a different geographical environment. So the weight of geography remains. And so one could envisage all sorts of developments, worsening relations, but one can also envisage, and here I'm talking more about the longue durée, one can envisage strengthening of those relations again. But I don't think re-entry of the UK into the EU is on the horizon in any. I think everyone would say, "Oh no." But I do think that there can be avenues of improvement. But equally, as Fabian says, this can get worse. But there's agency. There's agency and choices, and let's see what happens. But I do think it's this particular Johnson government is very distinctive. I think even May's government, even though I thought Chequers was never going to fly, at least there was an attempt to maintain complex interdependence.
Thanks so much, Ian.
Government incompetence versus government ideology. I mean, it's quite hard to disentangle the two, because the incompetence springs from an ideological approach to facts that stubbornly refuse to fit with the preconceptions that the government has. I absolutely agree with Brigid that Ben Wallace has been the sort of star performer, and that's because actually he doesn't seem to have a particularly strong ideological view. He's prepared to confront the facts as he comes to them. I mean, I think just on Juha's point about security cooperation and so on, and security competition, I mean, it does seem to me that this has actually turned out to be a reasonably productive area. I mean, there's a certain amount of posturing, and I think Nicoletta referred to the sort of visits to Ukraine and so on. So there is a certain amount of posturing, but actually there's quite a lot of pragmatic cooperation. The thing that does slightly worry me is where does the EU go with defense industrial cooperation? Because it can be a good thing, and the Commission knocking a few heads together and getting people to combine national programs so that you get more economies of scale and so on could conceivably be a good thing. But the UK is still going to have one of the largest defence industrial sectors in Europe, and if it's shut out in the future, I don't think that is going to be beneficial either for the UK or indeed for the EU. But most importantly, it's not going to be beneficial for the collective European defence effort, and God knows I think we're going to need more of that in the future.
Thanks so much. We seem to be just out of time now, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for this very informative and interesting session. We've covered a lot of ground for this early in the morning, so I think we all deserve our coffee now. Just a few quick conclusions. I think we all agreed that the TCA is a very thin deal that doesn't really provide us with a basis to regulate the challenges that are now posed by the war in Ukraine. Internal differentiation is unavoidable, but we should take this opportunity to go further, and the EU is integrated in ways that it possibly couldn't have were the UK a member. And in terms of external differentiation, the EU should use this new confidence that it's gotten from Brexit in a way, leverage the power of the single market, and maybe rethink some of its messy structures in common foreign security and defence policy. So just say thank you so much again. We'll take a short coffee break now, and the next session will kick off at 10:45 on democracy and legitimacy in a differentiated EU. Thank you.